Not a week goes by without someone in South Africa being assassinated. In 2022 alone, 141 assassinations were recorded by the Global Initiative. That's an average of more than 2 a week. And even that is probably an undercount, given the limited sources of data. In some cases, targeted killings allow criminal groups to influence politics or gain control of lucrative markets. Some assassinations are intended to silence and intimidate whistleblowers and journalists. But most of the hits recorded by the Global Initiative between 2000 and 2022 were linked to the taxi industry. The largely unregulated taxi industry is a lifeline for millions of South Africa's commuters. It is low cost and serves many areas not covered by official public transport networks. But it is also controlled by mafia-like associations who extort their drivers and compete for control over lucrative routes. Taxi-related violence ranges from shootouts at taxi ranks to targeted hits on large, influential players in the industry. These then often spiral out of control as groups embark on retaliatory killings and resulting in the deaths of hundreds of taxi operators and innocent bystanders. According to the Global Organized Crime Index, mafia-style groups, such as those operating in the taxi industry, are a prevalent criminal actor in South Africa, with a score of 7.5 out of 10. And overall, the country's criminality score is very high, at 7.18 out of 10, placing it 7th out of 193 countries. With me to discuss taxi-related violence and assassinations in South Africa is Rumbi Matimba, an analyst with the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime and author of the report, The Business of Killing Assassinations in South Africa. Rumbi, welcome to the Index. Now, looking at the data in your report, we can see that there are spikes in the number of assassinations in certain years, like in 2000, 2007, and 2018. What caused these spikes?
Thank you, Thin. So what we see is that a lot of the spikes within the taxi industry are related to competition over lucrative taxi routes. And this is usually between different taxi associations. So if we go back to as far as 2000, we see that there were spikes in violence due to, again, competition over lucrative routes. But just going back slightly to about 1999, the South African government had also introduced something called the Taxi Recapitalization Program. And that led to some pushback from within the taxi industry as well, which led to some of those spikes that we saw within the violence. Moving forward to about 2000, again, competition over lucrative routes, where we saw spikes, particularly in the Gauteng region, where there was competition over the route that extends from Soweto in Johannesburg to the Bree taxi rank. And here we saw high levels of violence that were linked between two taxi associations, namely the Faraday Taxi Association, as well as the Dobsonville, Rudeport, Leratong, Johannesburg Taxi Association. Moving forward to 2018, the peaks that we saw there were mostly in the Western Cape, KwaZulu-Natal, as well as Gauteng region. Competition again over lucrative routes. And when we look at Gauteng specifically, some of those spikes were linked to high levels of violence that were initiated by the Kempton Park Taxi Association.
What about also the steep increase that we saw, most recently between 2021 and 2022 in the Western Cape of taxi-related killings? Are these the same causes or is it different?
Absolutely. So 2021 in the Western Cape, we saw a rival taxi association, SOCATA, which is the Cape Amalgamated Taxi Association, versus CODETA, which is the Congress for Democratic Taxi Associations in the Western Cape. And these two taxi associations were locked in a dispute over which group had the rights to the B97 taxi route. And this B97 taxi route extends between Belleville taxi rank and Mbekweni in Paarl, and that led to spikes in violence in the Western Cape.
Now, South Africa scores really high in the OC index, right? In fact, 7th overall globally. How much does the taxi industry and those associated with it contribute to this position?
So what our research has shown, Thin, is that the taxi industry is enmeshed within organized crime in South Africa. So, firstly, the taxi industry, because of its unregulated nature, where it has had to get hitmen who are then regulators and enforcers within the industry. This has led to the creation of a pool of hitmen, which is then recruited not only within the taxi industry itself, but then exported to other criminal markets as well, within the organized crime infrastructure within South Africa. So we find that the taxi industry is largely involved in things such as extortion and protection racketeering, where there's competition over means of control, again, because the taxi industry is unregulated. But then we've also found within our research that the taxi industry is ideally placed for money laundering because it is largely cash in nature. And so that leads again to tax evasion as well as fraud within the industry. In addition to this, the taxi industry is also leading to high levels of corruption because we found that sometimes police officers themselves or politicians have taxis, their own taxi businesses. And so that leads to a conflict of interest in trying to resolve some of the taxi related conflict that we see. And so those are some of the reasons that have led to the taxi industry being so enmeshed within organized crime in South Africa.
Now, I want to follow up on the regulatory aspect that you mentioned. Like you said, right, the taxi industry is unregulated or largely self-regulated, right, where it determines its own routes and fares. But then, there is some sort of regulation by internal sort of regional bodies known as taxi associations, like you just mentioned, and this new body. You've mentioned those just now, but could you explain a little bit about who are these associations? Who runs these bodies? How do they actually work?
Okay, so what our research has found is that taxi associations are membership bodies, and these membership bodies coalesce around specific routes. What they are is that they are representative bodies for taxi drivers. And so, what the taxi associations do in determining routes is they negotiate between each other. So, between other taxi associations amongst each other, they negotiate for routes, determining fares, determining how many drivers are on a specific route. But then, in addition to that, they also negotiate with private companies, and so they will instruct private companies, such as bus companies, for example, that you can use this route, and you also can charge this fare or this amount for this specific route. But in addition to that, that taxi associations, because of just how unregulated they are, you have the introduction of private security companies as well as hitmen in this instance, who then come in as enforcers to make sure that once there's an agreement on which routes to use and what fares to charge, those are stuck to by the different taxi associations. In this way, you then have the creation of a pool of hitmen that is not only available to work within the taxi industry as enforcers, which they are largely intended to do, but then also now extend to other criminal markets.
Media reports in the Western Cape has revealed how, minibus taxi drivers have also threatened public and private school transport drivers, right? They were demanding that school children are transported by their taxis instead. Can you tell us to what extent does this violence impact innocent bystanders? And does the fact that these taxi drivers were sort of promised a contract by the Western Cape Department of Education play a role in the conflict?
So then they contribute to violence against innocent bystanders to a very large extent. In some cases, you have school children unable to go to school because of the violence that is within the taxi industry, or because the taxi industry will not allow their private school transport to transport them. We've seen reports of hospitals, clinics being affected because staff that work in hospitals or clinics cannot go to work because of taxi strikes or because of taxi related violence. So in this way, you have a ripple effect where innocent bystanders are caught within the crossfire. So we've read reports of children being hit by stray bullets, for example. And this is just some of the ways that this violence impacts innocent bystanders. So you have people being unattended at clinics and in hospitals simply because of the violence and just the effect of the violence on everything else within the country.
What measures are being taken to control this violence?
So then there have been quite a few commissions of inquiry dating as far back as the 1990s to the mid 2000s, where the government was trying to get to the root of the taxi violence. In addition to these commissions of inquiries, there have been peace agreements that are signed between different taxi associations, for example. We've also seen some of the taxi routes that have been contested being closed off or blocked by the government so that no taxis utilize that route. But within all of this, killings and violence within the taxi industry has continued unabated. So it does seem that whatever has happened has not been enough to curb the killings that we see. So, because of the long history of violence within the taxi industry, people are being killed today over routes that people were killed in the 1990s, for example. So the violence just has continued unabated despite attempts by government to intervene within the industry and put an end to the violence.
Now, despite the control that mafia groups have over this taxi industry, it is also still possible to get an Uber, right? So, my last question to you, Rumbi, is how widespread is the taxi mafia's control, and what does the relationship to services like Uber look like?
The mafia style groups that have control over the taxi industry's reach extends to the private sector as well. So the reach of the taxi industry does extend to the private sector. So in terms of companies such as Uber, for example, their drivers have been targeted. Bus companies have also been targeted. Some trains have also been attacked by the taxi drivers, all in an attempt to move traffic from those private companies back into the taxi industry. So while it is still possible to get an Uber in South Africa, there are some places where you simply cannot get an Uber because the taxi industry does not allow it. So there are certain shopping malls that are known that Uber does not operate from, or commuters have to walk a certain distance before they can actually request an Uber on their phone. Because if it is seen within the vicinity of the taxi mall, for example, or of the shopping mall, for example, they get attacked by the taxi industry. So instances like this illustrate just the reach of the taxi industry and how it's affected the private sector as well. So Uber is operating within this conflicted environment.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of The Index. A special thank you to Rumbi. If you'd like to read Rumbi's report, The Business of Killing Assassinations in South Africa, head over to the GI-TOC's website, globalinitiative.net, where you can keep an eye out for the upcoming report on political assassinations in South Africa, ahead of the May 2024 general elections. To find out more about criminality and resilience in South Africa, head over to ocindex.net. Remember that the Global Organized Crime Index is a totally free resource and it's available to everyone.